Thank you for joining the May 2026 VMware TAM customer webinar. This webinar is organized by the VMware TAM organization to provide our customers the opportunity to interact with great speakers about content that will help them get the full benefit from their VMware software. Before we get into today's content, there are just a couple of announcements. Our next TAM customer webinar will be on June 18th and will cover what's new in VCF Operations 9.1, specifically the build pillar. This will kick off a series of sessions every fourth week that will dig deeper into another area of VCF. Your interaction during this webinar is important, so please make use of the Q&A feature of Zoom to ask your questions. If we are unable to answer your question during this webinar, please be sure and reach out to your TAM and ask them to follow up. At the end of today's session, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey related to this session and any topic suggestions for the future. We do read these responses and appreciate your completion of the survey. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded. Your TAM will have the recording, and it'll also be posted in a couple of days to the VMware TAM Services YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to get the updates when new content is available. That brings us to today's speaker and topic. Feidhlim O'Leary is a product marketing engineer and will be talking to us about vSphere configuration profiles. Feidhlim, please go ahead.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody. Like Brian said, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A panel on Zoom. I'm going to try and answer as many of those live as they come in throughout the session. So we're going to talk about vSphere configuration profiles. I don't have many slides. I do have some demos and a live lab that I want to take you through some different workflows and take a look at what does a vSphere configuration profile actually look like. We'll look at the actual JSON file live. My name is Feidhlim O'Leary. I work in our technical product marketing division of the VCF division of Broadcom. So why are we talking about vSphere configuration profiles? Well, if you haven't gotten the memo from the vSphere 9 release notes, host profiles are deprecated. So vSphere 9 or VCF 9 is the last release that will support host profiles. And what we mean by deprecated, just so that there's no misunderstanding, is that host profiles are still supported. You can still use them if you are currently using them, but the next major version of VCF, let's call it the hypothetical VCF 10, will no longer contain host profiles. So 9.0, 9.1, future 9.2, 9.3, and so on, those will still contain host profiles, but they are deprecated. We're urging customers to move over to the new vSphere configuration profiles. And why is that? So there's a couple of different reasons. vSphere configuration profiles is built on more modern APIs, right? Under the hood, ESX configuration has pretty much all transitioned to what we call the ESX config store. No longer do services and bits and pieces store their config in all various directories and different formats. Everything is centralized in the ESX config store. So it's a single API endpoint to edit, manipulate, change configuration. vSphere configuration profiles is also more human readable. It's in a JSON format, similar to the vCenter profiles that we also have. So you can export the document and you can read it, even if you've never seen JSON format before, if you've never seen a vSphere configuration profile before, you can understand what it's trying to tell you. Compare that to exporting a host profile. If you've ever opened that up in Notepad or something, it's what I call here a Frankenstein's monster of XML. It's all various bits and pieces all jumbled together because it's using a variety of different commandlets to change different types of configuration, because we didn't have a standard config store when we developed host profiles. There are some portability challenges with host profiles as well, because it actually exports all the configuration on a host, and that includes things down to hardware device identifiers as well. It makes it less portable if we're going across different hardware vendors. Configuration profiles actually only takes the delta of what's changed between a default config versus what you have configured. So you'll see when we look at the actual profile itself, it's actually not that long. Now, there are some challenges with vSphere configurations currently that are on the roadmap to be resolved. The first thing is it does only support cluster objects right now. So standalone hosts are not currently supported with vSphere configuration profiles. We are looking to solve this problem because we do know that there are customers out there that have hosts on the edge, for example, or standalone hosts that might be in remote offices, similar to like a robo situation. And we are looking to bring a configuration management to standalone hosts in the future. And there are still certain configuration items that you can do with host profiles that are currently not supported with vSphere configuration profiles. The most obvious one, and the one that customers often have asked us about, is controlling things like the service stop start settings. So making sure that the SSH service is stopped or started and controlling its startup policy. That isn't currently possible with vSphere configuration profiles, but again, it is something that we are looking to solve in a future release. So vSphere configuration profiles takes a look at the configuration at a cluster object level. You don't have to attach a profile, manage different documents in a different part of the UI. You don't have to have the answer files as a separate configuration spec either. Everything is wrapped into the cluster object. And we'll see that when we're looking at some of the demos as well. And it takes into account the general settings, so all the host agnostic settings. It can manipulate storage, networking, some security parameters, and it integrates with solutions like vSAN and NSX. The core, I suppose, end goal with vSphere configuration profiles is similar to host profiles, right? We want to have a consistent configuration across all our hosts in a cluster. And that's exactly what configuration profiles does. We can monitor and remediate configuration drift. So again, similar to host profiles, if a host or multiple hosts are out of compliance with the desired state configuration, we can remediate those hosts or that cluster back into a desired state. We support distributed switches, secure boot, vSAN, NSX. There shouldn't be any adoption blockers now in VCF 9 to take advantage of vSphere configuration profiles. And it has a straightforward user interface as well. So you go to your cluster object, you go to the desired state configuration view, and you can check compliance, you can run pre-checks, you can remediate, you can manipulate and edit the configuration there as well. So notice you're not leaving, I suppose, the main inventory view of the vSphere client. You're not going to the host profiles section of the UI like you would with host profiles. You're staying within the main inventory page. You're in the configure tab of the cluster itself. Some of these boxes are misaligned, I apologize. So we have end-to-end UI workflows. You can create drafts, you can import drafts from file. A draft is where we're editing the configuration. If we're making changes to an existing configuration state, we first create what we call a draft. And a draft then can be pre-checked. So you can create a draft, create a configuration change, and almost pre-stage it to the cluster to see, is this change going to negatively impact my cluster? Are there any blockers that I currently need to resolve? If the pre-check passes, you're safe then to apply the configuration. There's a question in the chat there from Dave asking about STIGs, applying such changes like STIGs that you can perform on host profiles today. So depending on what the configuration change is, you can use vSphere configuration profiles to apply those changes, such as STIGs. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning, there are certain configurations recommendations that cannot be applied with vSphere configuration profiles. Like I said, SSH, making sure if the SSH service is disabled, that's not something that vSphere configuration profiles can currently manage. There is also, I suppose, a next level up of vSphere configuration profiles when we're using VCF operations and using VCF operations and its templates and its security profiles. to manage that configuration at a fleet level as well. And we have another question about, is vSphere configurations available in VVF? It is available in VVF. It's available at both VVF and VCF entitlements. I don't believe that we have this gated behind any particular license. And we'll get to the question on NSX in a moment, so I'll just hold that one until we get to that slide. Now, in 9.1, or 9.0 and 9.1, we're introducing a couple of things. So we have NSX integration, and we'll talk about that in a slide coming up. We introduced NSX integration in 9.0, where you can manage the transport node configuration through the vSphere configuration profiles. We've introduced vSAN integration in 9.1, so you can manage your vSAN configuration. And I'm going to show you some of that in the live demo as well. Memory tiering introduced in vSphere 8, update 3 as a tech preview, GA in 9.0, and expanded on in 9.1. That is the only, well, not the only way. You can still use some of the CLI options to apply memory tiering, but vSphere configuration profiles is currently the recommended way to do that. There's automatic remediation, which is allowing for automatic remediation to happen when a new host is added to a cluster. And we will look at demos of automatic remediation, memory tiering, a little bit of the vSAN integration. And the last bullet here is VDS Bootstrap with zero-touch provisioning. Zero-touch provisioning is essentially our next iteration of what you would be familiar with auto-deploy. So network boot installation of ESX using vSphere configuration profiles to do the full end-to-end configuration so that the host joins vCenter, joins the cluster, and is fully configured. So from boot up process to fully production ready. Now, with automatic remediation, it's designed for adding new hosts to an existing vSphere configuration profile cluster. Now, it does require that any of the new hosts that are coming into the cluster, either the cluster configuration has their host-specific attributes pre-configured, so things like its individual IP address for VMK0, VMK1, 2, and so on, or that those hosts already have those VM kernel ports configured. The reason for this is when we enable automatic remediation of a new incoming host, vSphere configuration profiles will attempt to extract any of the host specific attributes from that host and then use them to apply the rest of the configuration. If those host specific attributes don't yet exist, so if we're missing VMK1, for example, on the host and it's not already defined in the profile, VCP has no way to know what your intended IP address is. And we'll look at that in our demos as well in a moment. For NSX configuration, this one is a little bit more of a challenge sometimes for customers that are coming from the NSX side, because when you enable VCP on a cluster, you're no longer able to use the NSX manager to do the application of the transport node profile. You'll see in the screenshot, you have the VCP little badge next to the clusters if they're enabled. And the checkbox is actually grayed out next to those. So you can't actually check the box and use NSX to apply the transport node profile. What you do have to do is move to the vSphere client, move to VCP, and apply the transport node profile from the vSphere configuration profile side. All it takes in is the path, the policy path of the transport node profile, and that's the minimum requirement that you would need, and you can save that, and it will integrate with NSX. When we apply this profile, there's hooks in so that vCenter will talk back up to NSX and do what it needs to do to apply the profile. And for vSAN configuration, it's all here. Now, in my experience, this is coming in 9.1. It's far, I think, it's a little bit more user-friendly to use the existing vSAN configuration UI and the wizards to configure vSAN from a greenfield site, right? It's a little bit cumbersome right now to configure vSAN greenfield using vSphere configuration profiles. But where this will become more powerful is being able to export that vSAN configuration and apply it to other clusters to make sure that you're not only having a consistent configuration in your, let's say, your compute configuration, but you can also have a consistent configuration across your vSAN and make that easier across multiple clusters. And I'm going to show some of this as well, and some of the gotchas that you may encounter should you be activating vSAN on an already existing VCP enabled cluster. This is just a look at the VCF operations UI. Again, this is from VCF 9.1. It integrates with vSphere configuration profiles. You can manage all your clusters at a fleet level and see a single pane of glass to detect drift of the configuration. So you don't have to go to each individual cluster. You can do this all from VCF Ops to see multiple clusters. There's also vCenter configuration, but that's a separate topic. And it also allows you to schedule drift detection. We don't have that. There is a periodic drift detection in vCenter. I think it might be every 24 hours. I'm not 100% sure. I'll need to double check that. But you can set up a custom drift detection in VCF Ops to alert you if there is any configuration drift. We don't do automatic remediation of drift, just because there may be cases where it's expected drift. You're making a particular configuration change, maybe temporarily. You're working with GS, you're doing some troubleshooting, you're doing some testing. We don't want to automatically keep remediating a cluster if you're doing some desired changes. And we just have a slide here on zero-touch provisioning. This is something new that's coming in VCF 9.1. Like I said, it's analogous to auto-deploy today. It's just a more modern, updated version of similar technology where we boot the host, it uses UEFI, and it goes and it talks to vCenter. vCenter will provide the cluster location, the image, and the configuration using VCP so that the host can boot, get ESX installed, join the cluster, and be fully configured. One of the major differences between ZTP and auto-deploy is no TFTP requirement. The host boots and talks to vCenter directly using HTTPS boot protocols. There's no PXE, kind of initial PXE stage, and then another bootloader. It's all just native UEFI. Now we have a bunch of links here that I'll post in the chat when we in a moment. Various different blogs. You'll find them all at the VCF blog at blogs.vmware.com/cloud foundation. And there's a couple of blogs here, and there's going to be more added as we develop more. We have transitioning to vSphere configuration profiles, replicating config from one cluster to another. There's a getting started using Power CLI. And my colleague Jatin has written some more advanced automation and API-based blogs as well to really take advantage of the APIs that are available for this. So just before I jump to the demos, let me just check the Q&A. Okay, we have a question about a KB or a link, or a KB or a doc that notes the current gaps in VCP compared to host profiles. I don't believe that is currently published, but I believe it's actually in the works and should be available when VCF 9.1 GA is announced. But it's not currently available right now. And another question is, what is the recommended migration path from host profiles to configuration profiles for existing clusters? That's a great question because that is going to be the first demo that we look at. So let's jump to our demo screen here. Okay. So let me make sure this is the right demo. It is. Okay. So in this demo, sorry, now I'm going to be looking at my other screen for this. We have a cluster here, and this is running vSphere 9.0.2, I believe. So we have our cluster here. Our management cluster has a couple of VMs. And it currently has a host profile attached. It's compliant with the host profile, right? When you're transitioning from host profiles to vSphere configuration profiles, the first thing that I would recommend is make sure that your hosts are compliant with the host profile, that your hosts are actually at the configuration that you want them to be. It will make the transition much simpler and non-disruptive. So we go to our configure tab and scroll down to desired state and configuration. So if this is an existing cluster coming from, let's say, vSphere 8 or created without VCP enabled, you'll see this create configuration button. And we'll check if the configuration can be managed at a cluster level. This will typically do actually some checks as well to make sure that the cluster's image is consistent. So if you have one host on 9.0 and one host on 9.1, I believe we actually pause you here and ask you to remediate the cluster from an image perspective to make sure that all the hosts are consistent there first. Now, if we have host profiles attached like we do in this cluster, we will get this message that just tells you a host profile is attached, and the host profile should be detached once the transition is complete. If you forget to detach the host profile, it's not a big deal. The host profile operations will actually get blocked once the cluster is transitioned. So if you do forget to detach the host profile, you shouldn't need to worry about it. You won't be able to have both features operating on the same cluster. It is a one-way transition as well. Once you transition to vSphere configuration profiles, there's no way going back. The only way, unfortunately, would be to create a brand new cluster, do not enable VCP on it during the cluster creation, and move the hosts into the new cluster. Now, because this is an existing host profile enabled cluster, I'm going to just, I've done my due diligence. I know that the host profile is compliant. I know all my hosts have the expected configuration I want them to use. So I'm going to import from a reference host. I'm going to choose host 1 here. Click import. And again, this is very similar to extracting a host profile from a reference host. Similar concept. We just pull in all the information from that host we choose. If we were doing, for example, we already had enabled VCP on another cluster and we already had a configuration spec that we've updated for this particular cluster, we could import from file as well. But we're just going to go next. It'll just double check the configuration. A transition from host profiles to VCP is 99 times out of 100 going to just be a very quick next, because all we're doing is changing what's managing the configuration. We're not actually changing the configuration itself. So if we want to preview the configuration in JSON, we can hit export. If we want to look at the configuration schema, we can do that also. And we'll look at those respective as well in a moment. If we do export the configuration and we see, oh, actually there's some configuration here that I do want to change, we can change it in the JSON file that we export and then re-import the file once we've made our edits. We're not going to do that in this particular demo. We're just going to hit next and we'll finish and apply. So because we're just doing a direct transition from host profiles to VCP, we're not making any configuration changes. So no host will be put into maintenance mode, no host will be rebooted. It's a non-disruptive operation, not even maintenance mode. And that's that transitions our hosts. Now you'll see some of the UI will say applying configuration, remediating. That's not necessarily 100% accurate when we're doing this direct transition because we're not making any changes to the configuration. And that's how easy it is to transition from host profiles to VCP. Now we have a question in the chat about firmware and driver versions. So that would come into play when we're for the pre-checks to make sure that the image on the cluster, so the actual ESX version, firmware and driver, that those are compliant at that stage. It's not necessarily done by vSphere configuration profiles, but it's done by vSphere Lifecycle Manager. And both of those, VCP and VLCM, they very much work in tandem together. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, so let's change gears and let's look at the auto remediation function. Full screen again. Okay, so again, we've got a lab. This is actually running 9.1 code. We've got our cluster 2 here, which has VCP enabled. Perhaps we've already transitioned it from host profiles or whatever. We've got ESX4 that we want to actually add to this cluster. So if we take a look at this particular host, just take a look at some of it's still running standard switches, for example. It does have its VM kernel ports already pre-configured. Now they're just running on standard switch. When this host gets added to the cluster, they will move to the distributed switch port groups that the rest of the cluster is currently running. And it currently doesn't have any data store. It's a brand new host, no data store. So auto remediation is not enabled by default. It is something that you come in and you have to edit the remediation settings. And down here we have auto remediate newly added hosts. You do need to opt into that at the cluster level, or you can change it at the global level as well. So once that's enabled, we can add our host. Just choose it from the existing list. And it can be quite quick that once the host is added, we'll very quickly see an applying configuration to the host. Let's jump to our operation details and remediation status to see that the host is already been remediated. Check the compliance view. Host is fully remediated. So again, it's that quick to add new hosts to an existing cluster, as long as we've got either the host specific information already defined on the host or in the profile itself. Okay, so let me just check some questions. Can you schedule the remediation? You cannot in vSphere schedule the remediation. It's not currently possible. You could set up some automation to schedule the remediation using the APIs. But currently, the remediation is not a schedule item. Okay, let me clear some of these questions. Domain join using configuration profiles. That I may need to double check. I know domain ESX host domain join is possible with host profiles. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head if it's possible with configuration profiles. We'll take a note of that. Brian, if you wouldn't mind taking a note of that question, and we can follow up offline for David. Okay, so let's jump to our next demo. Our next demo is going to be a memory tiering configuration. And just a couple of other questions that have popped in. Can you remediate a single host rather than the whole cluster? Currently, no. It is a cluster-wide. It is a cluster-wide remediation rather than individual hosts at a time. You can choose host overrides, and we'll look at those as well, and about being able to have different configuration on individual hosts within a cluster for whatever use case. We will take a look at a demo of that as well. It might help answer your question as well. Certificate renewal is outside the scope of vSphere configuration profiles. That would be something completely different, but it is something that we have in VCF operations. Okay. Do we have a demo of zero-touch provisioning? We do. I wasn't going to actually include it because it's not, it's VCP is just a small portion of it, but I'm glad you asked for it, and I will have it at the end as well. Okay, so I'll come back to the questions. Let me just get to the memory tiering configuration, because this is the preferred way of enabling memory tiering. And we'll look at this from the guise of we want to enable memory tiering and also software mirroring, which is another new feature of memory tiering coming in vSphere or VCF 9.1. So we have our cluster. We're going to go to configure and our desired state configuration. Now we're going to create a draft. We're going to create a draft using the UI. So we'll go to the draft tab. Again, a draft is when we want to create a copy of the settings, and then we're going to make edits to those settings. So we create a draft. You can also export the JSON document, make edits in a text editor or any other tool, and then re-import the document. I'm just going to show you the UI method for now. We will look at the JSON document momentarily as well. So under our ESX settings, we've got mem tier, so memory tiering. There's only one setting here for NVMe to configure. So we have to either enable or disable it. So we'll enable it as true. And we've got device and mirror device. So for device, we're going to select our first NVMe in our list. Ignore my very small NVMe devices. This is just done in a small little lab. Very easily just select the disks from the list. And if we want to do mirroring, we'll select our second NVMe device. And this will automatically create the software-based mirroring for the NVMe's for redundancy purposes. I'm not going to go into the details of everything in memory tiering. I just want to show what is possible with vSphere configuration profiles. And we'll look at this, we'll see this configuration as well in its JSON format as well. I want to start with the user interface first. So we'll save that. There was an option for encryption as well. I just didn't click that option for this particular demo. Now we'll run a pre-check. Again, this will take the draft and almost do a dry run of it against the existing host in the cluster, make sure that there's no incompatibilities found. We're good, so we will apply the changes. And this one will put hosts into maintenance mode. So we don't have to reboot the host to activate memory tiering, but the host will need to go into maintenance mode, and we'll do that one by one. So we'll put each host into maintenance mode sequentially. So hit remediate. Let's go to our operation details just to see it a little bit more detail. And each of our hosts will flip into maintenance mode, activate memory tiering, and flip back out of maintenance mode. Now I did this on a cluster without virtual machines just to avoid having that vMotion time for the sake of the demo. But obviously, if you have running virtual machines, vMotion and DRS will kick in there. So if we go back to our compliance view, see that our cluster is compliant. And if we go to our summary tab, we now have our memory tiering appears on our cluster summary. Now, again, this is just a net new cluster. We've got nothing in tier 1 right now. If we had running virtual machines, over time, we will see that the cold cold pages or the cold memory of those workloads will start to get moved to our tier 1 or NVMe devices. But I just wanted to show how using vSphere configuration profiles, we can enable memory tiering. Okay, let me take a quick look at the Q&A. Okay, I see, Jeremy, you've answered the question on the domain join. Thank you very much for that, where it is possible using vSphere configuration profiles. Yes, Fiber Channel or iSCSI are supported. I was just for storage for VCP. I was just using NFS. That's just because what I have in my environment, but any of the storage models are supported. Follow up on the scheduled remediation. Is there a way to commit the draft, but delay the remediation for later? Not really. The committal of the draft is the remediation. They're one in the same, but you can create the draft, run the pre-check, and you can pause there. You still have the draft is still saved as a draft, and you can come back, you know, a day, a month, a week later, or wherever how long you want, and then click the remediation button. So you don't have to always immediately apply the draft. You can create it, pre-check the draft, and then come back and remediate later. Can you add it in using auto remediation and keep it in maintenance mode? That's a good question. I believe we will automatically take a host out of maintenance mode once it has completed its configuration. That might be something that I can bring back to product management to maybe include as an option. But currently, once we add a new host to a VCP cluster and we remediate the host or remediate the cluster, it will automatically take the host out of maintenance mode. We have a demo of ZTP coming up. And that's a repeat question. So passwords, I'm glad you asked a question about password monitoring, because this is a potential current limitation of VCP. Let me put it this way. VCP can manage the root password on the ESX hosts. However, if you're using a third-party password management, or even if you're currently using VCF operations to do the password management, you will end up in a state where the two management systems may be fighting for ownership of the root password. So, for example, if you use VCP to change the root password, it's not going to update any third-party or VCF ops password management. If you use the third party or the VCF ops password management to change the root password on a host, it's not going to update the VCP either. So it is currently a little bit of a management overhead where you do have to potentially do a little bit of double management of root passwords. This is a challenge that PM are aware of and are looking to solve in a future release also. What if the cluster is enabled with VKS? That should be no problem. We support using vSphere configuration profiles on clusters that are running VKS or the supervisor cluster as well. There's no issue there. Is the draft per user, or will anybody in the environment be able to access the draft? Anybody with the cluster with administrative privileges. There may be some, I don't know the exact privileges off the top of my head here, but if you've got two users that both have the same administrative privileges, there's still only one draft. It's one draft per cluster, not draft per user. However, if you export the configuration into JSON format, into the JSON document, multiple users could have their own versions of the same draft, and you could use some version control software as well to manage the JSON documents as well in that capacity. But from the user interface, there's only ever one draft, and it's the same draft regardless of who would log into the system as long as they have permissions. And more of a statement rather than a question, memory tiering in VCF9 is more straightforward than the GUI. Yes, I believe it is. There were some gaps in 9.0 where you still had to use the CLI. In 9.1, you can use the end-to-end UI to enable memory tiering. Okay, so what's our next demo is, okay, host overrides, and then we will have the ZTP demo. So in this example, again, I've got my cluster, it's got 4 hosts. I'm going to just do a quick example of, and this can be done for pretty much any configuration, but I'm just going to choose to add a different data store to one of my ESX hosts. It's not going to get added to all the hosts. I only want to add it to one as an override. So let me, where do we start on this one? Okay, so let's go to draft. Again, we're going to create a draft. And we go down to storage. I'm using NFS, but again, we do support all the other storage types. So this is my common NFS settings. So we just have one NFS mount for the 4 hosts. Again, this is just my small little lab environment, and we use VMK1 as our interface for the NFS connection. If we go to host overrides, there's currently no host overrides. So we'll add one. We can do it add by hostname or BIOS UUID. Hostname is usually more straightforward. And I'm going to put an override for ESX1. Okay, so now if you go to overrides, select the dropdown. So currently the override is the same as the common settings because we haven't actually edited the override. So let's go in to edit, expand this out. We're going to add another data store. We'll add NFS01 only to this particular ESX host. Let's put my host name, share the volume name. We're binding to read only is false. Yes, we're going to bind to VMK1 and hit save. Okay. Sometimes the UI does flip back. So now we have our host override for ESX1, and it's going to mount an additional NFS data store and run a pre-check. A pre-check always happens when you try and apply anyway. I'm just doing it as an individual step for the sake of the demo. And let's apply the changes. Now, in the host level details here, we can see exactly what's happening to each of the individual hosts. And it just to show that only ESX1 is going to have any configuration change to it. We only added the override for 1. So ESX2, 3, and 4, there's no impact to them. This is going to be should be a relatively quick task. Okay. So if we go over to our ESX1, he has a new NFS added. 2, 3, and 4 still have just the 1. But that's to show that the cluster is in compliance because we have added an override so that ESX1 is expected to have 2 data stores, while ESX2, 3, and 4 only are expected to have the 1. And like I said, you can do this override for many of the settings. I mean, a typical example would be passwords. Rather than having the same root password on all hosts in the cluster, that's how my spec is configured right now. You may want to have an override or a host-specific password for each individual host as well. And you can use host overrides for that as well. Okay, and last demo, I'm just checking the time, is ZTP. And I do want to look at the JSON document live as well for you as well. So with zero-touch provisioning, what I have here is I have a cluster, an empty cluster, but it's a configured cluster. If we look at our configuration, we're here just in the networking portion. We've got VMK0, VMK1, VMK2 already configured. You can actually, and this isn't unique to ZTP, you can have a cluster fully configured without having any hosts currently attached. All you need to know is the host UUID, which is a hardware-based ID. There's some power CLI that you can easily grab that as well. So before you even add any host to a cluster, you can have a cluster configured. So that's a one powerful way that it differs from host profiles as well. So we have our cluster fully configured for 4 hosts. So let's enable ZTP. It's because it is an evolution of auto deploy. Let's go to the auto deploy UI. We'll enable zero touch provisioning on our cluster, and it'll create a network boot bank. That went a little bit fast, but there's a boot bank created in vCenter for the individual cluster object as well. And then similar to auto deploy, we do need to create some deployment rules. I'm just going to leave this as to apply to all hosts. You can create different patterns so that the rule will apply to a particular vendor string, IDs, MAC address range, things like that. Just for simplicity, I'm going to keep it simple. And while we do have checkboxes here for settings, image, we actually only need host location. The reason for that is when we're using ZTP, because we're using vSphere Lifecycle Manager for the image management, and we're using vSphere configuration profiles for the configuration, that all gets inherited by the cluster object. So you don't have to manually choose an image or a host profile in the deployment rule. Like it says here in the UI, it's automatically picked up from the cluster. So let's activate the rule as well. It's just a last step. And something unique then to ZTP is this UEFI boot URL. This is really all you need to tell your UEFI or your physical hardware. This is where I want you to boot. So typically, depending on the vendor, UEFI can boot from DHCP, or you can sometimes define static IP. Regardless, I'm using DHCP in this environment. There's going to be a parameter in the BIOS or in the UEFI to determine the boot URL. And you'll just need to put in the vCenter as the boot URL and ending in this .efi prefix. So let's go back to our inventory and the compliance view. So we have no hosts in the cluster. So I've got my 4 hosts here. They're ready to boot from the network. They have that boot URL configured as well. So let's kick these off. It goes pretty quickly. It's just talking to vCenter. It's making sure it adheres to the deployment rules, and then it will start getting the binaries from vCenter itself. So you can see in the background, the URL is actually vCenter because we're talking directly to vCenter to pull down the VIBs. Let me just kick off all 4 of these. And the process is pretty seamless from this point on. We download all the respective binaries from vCenter. We get the configuration is sent down as well, all as a single package. Now, there'll be a couple of different reboots. I think there's a total of 3, I guess, in total, because once we download the installer, we install ESXi, then there's a reboot. Then we do a staging of some of the configuration. And because certain configuration, and this may depend on the actual configuration that you're applying, I think the reason I have an extra reboot in mine is my configuration says to disable IPv6. And when you disable IPv6, that requires a reboot of the system. So we'll do an install. You see there, then there's a reboot. Now we're applying the configuration. And if the configuration does require an additional reboot, that's why I do see an extra one as well. Now, this is a little bit sped up just for the purposes of the demo as well. So while that's running, let me check the Q&A. Did that one. Can we use Holodeck to practice? You should, and I believe there will be hands-on labs. They're not available right now for 9.1. They should be available shortly after 9.1 GA. Where can you see a list of the overrides or selected items in the profile easily? So in the UI, okay, so the hosts are booted and they're joined vCenter, and there'll be a remediation process. The reason for this remediation process is when we boot the hosts initially, they get booted with a temporary distributed switch. Now, a distributed switch is a vCenter construct, right? It's managed by vCenter. So the host can't really know about the DVS until they join vCenter, and vCenter can't know about the host until they join vCenter. So there's a chicken and egg scenario. So we actually inject a temporary VDS onto the host during that boot up phase. And once they join the respective cluster, they will get moved over to their real VDS. But that's all it's all seamless. It's a very, very quick operation. I just wanted to explain some of the under the hood technicalities. But that's ZTP in action, using the power of vSphere configuration profiles, being able to inject all that configuration during the bootstrap phase. Sorry, now let me just jump back to the questions. Where can you see a list of the overrides? So that's a good point. Let me go to the live lab here. Hopefully this hasn't logged out. So in the UI, the overrides are at the individual level. So, you know, if we're in some configuration here, network, VMKNX, if I had some host overrides, they would show up here. If you want to see a full view of the overrides, let me see, do I have overrides on this guy? I do. Yeah, so this is from our demo earlier where we added the data store to ESX1. If I want to export the cluster configuration, we can do that. And we'll take a look at this. This is a good time to take a look at this. And let me see if I can just make this a little bit bigger. Okay. So I'm going to minimize some of these or just shrink them down for a moment. Let me leave storage open because that's applicable to what we're going to talk about. So, I mean, it's not that long of a document, and it is human readable. I mean, sometimes some of the references may not be immediately obvious, but it's far easier to read than a host profile, for example. So if you want to see a list of all host overrides on an individual host, the best option right now is to export the configuration. If you scroll down, you'll see a section called host override, and it'll be sorted then by host. So this is a host UUID. And this corresponds, I think, to the same host here, so ESX1. So the only override it has is in the storage portion. Okay, rather than the profile, let's say the host agnostic settings up here defines one NFS data store. For host one and only host one, we have an override for the NFS data stores where it contains two entries. So that means that only that host is going to have that particular configuration. If we scroll down to the host specific section, this is typically quite small. It's usually just things like the IP addresses and the host name. We also have the NVMe memory tiering here because each device is going to be unique to that individual host. That's why that section is visible here. But this is the entirety of, let's say, a host specific section. similar to the answer file if you're coming from host profiles. And you can use this standard format. You can use the schema as well to build up your own configuration from scratch. I know customers are out there that are essentially codifying their configuration and using that rather than building it in the UI or using Power CLI. The identifier is always going to be the hardware or the BIOS UUID. This should be unique at a hardware level. If you end up, making typos in this UUID, we're not going to be able to find that particular host. If you have duplicates in here, that's also going to cause errors as well. There should only be one unique UUID per host. Now, scrolling back up, so that's the host override and the host specific section. The section under profile ESX is all the cluster agnostic portions. So, for example, it's configuration that's going to be applied to all of the hosts. It doesn't have any host unique attributes. Things like we've got NTP, whether NVMe is enabled or not. Now, we could have NVMe tiering disabled on individual hosts if we want, and that would then land into host override or host specific sections. How the VMK NICs are configured minus their individual specific IPs. So whether DHCP is on IPv6, the name of the distributed switch, the path to the distributed switch or to the network, the port group name, MTU, all that stuff that's going to be agnostic at a host level. Gateways are going to be typically standardized across the board. You may have different gateways between same clusters in the same host, or hosts in the same cluster, if you're doing something like a stretch cluster. And then there's some VM kernel options, VDS options, and so on. Root password, I'm using the same root password. It's a hashed password. We don't have the password in plain text. I believe it's either SHA-256 or SHA-512 hash. This is another challenge that we have acknowledged from customers, that it may not always be the easiest thing to use VCP to change the password. You would have to hash your plain text password into the right format and then add it to the config spec. And I believe we have a KB article or documentation on that. Now, the last thing I wanted to show, and let me just quickly round off some of the questions. So host overrides, we just took a look at. Yes, we spoke about using VCF or VCF operations to manage the host passwords, because then the cluster state would go out of compliance. It is currently a challenge. If you do use VCF operations to change the passwords, you would have to come into your cluster and then update the cluster spec with the new password. Cisco Insight use ZTP to build a cluster. If the Cisco hosts support booting using HTTPS boot using UEFI, there should be no problem using those and ZTP to build a cluster. Again, if they support auto deploy today, it's likely that they would support ZTP. Does ZTP support stateless and stateful like auto deploy? It does only support stateful. We are moving away from the stateless model to more of a stateful only. That is our recommendation. But we will be still supporting auto deploy stateless in its current form. We have not deprecated auto deploy stateless currently. For ZTP, does the configuration also contain a specific VLAN? We use multiple VLANs in our environment. Yes, so not in my management network, but in my NFS network and my vMotion network, those VM kernel ports were tagged with different VLANs. It supports that configuration as well. It may depend on the UEFI BIOS that you're using, if that can actually boot and use a specific VLAN at that layer. But from the vSphere layer, from the ESX configuration layer, we support using specific VLANs. Is there a hardware compatibility matrix for ZTP? It's no different than the regular hardware compatibility. There's no additional hardware compatibility matrix needed. We are a brand new create design company. Is there a way we can extract from existing hosts to create one? So you can, even when you're in an existing cluster. For example, here we have a draft. We can import a draft from host. So we can actually choose one of the hosts in the cluster to create the draft from. And if you wish, then you can export that draft and then discard the draft from the cluster. So let's show that. So we'll pretend we took this draft. We can export the draft. We're not, I mean, right now it's the same, but we're not exporting the configuration settings. We're exporting the draft. Can also discard. Is JSON configuration portable across, I think you mean HP Gen 10, 11, 12? It should be vendor agnostic or hardware agnostic for the most part. Things like disk identifiers may be slightly different depending on the hardware vendor. But if we take a look at our we're not referencing any PCIe devices, for example. We're not referencing anything to that degree, or there's no, I don't believe there's any MAC addresses. I mean, we do MAC mode. It's right now it's set to PNIC based, but we're not hard coding any hardware specific stuff for the most part into the configuration documents. So it should be portable across different HPE models or between HP hosts and Dell hosts or Fujitsu, whatever it may be. And host profiles and config profiles, they do coexist during the transition, but once you transition, the host profiles are essentially disabled. You can no longer use a host profile on the cluster. In fact, this cluster may still have a host profile attached. Let's double check that. No, it's not, but that was in a different iteration. But if I try and take a host profile, it's all grayed out. It's disabled because VCP is already enabled on this particular cluster. How do you point a booting host to the appropriate vCenter for ZTP? So it is using the boot URL that I showed here, different lab. So you would configure your hardware level to the appropriate URL. Once you have auto deploy and image builder enabled, just give these a sec. I'll show you the URL again. It's always going to be in this format. So HTTPS, you can use the FQDN if you've got DNS enabled as well. And then /VMW, BRS, and VMBMX64.EFI. So that's always going to be the same format of the URL. And you can use that in DHCP options as well. You don't have to hard code it into the UEFI if you're not able to, for example. Okay. That would be nice. Highlight. Yeah, there's a lot of work that we still are hoping to accomplish in the user interface to make it more user friendly. For example, we do have a lot of, let's say, internal terminologies here, like mem tiering. We would create better friendly names and things like that. And there's some configurations here that we don't necessarily need to always expose. For example, like a lot of the in networking, you're typically only going to be configuring net stacks and VMK NICs for most of the use cases. We do hope to have some better UI changes in the future and maybe hide some of the lesser used configuration by default. Still have them there and editable, but hide them in the UI to streamline some of the UI process. Now, the last thing I wanted to do, I hope we're okay to go above the hour, Brian, is to just take a look at vSAN. So I have a vSAN data store created here on this cluster. You know, everything should be green. Everything's enabled. Everything's all good. Now, I created the vSAN data store after I enabled VCP on the cluster. And if we go to our cluster now, we haven't updated the configuration. So if we check our compliance, it's going to tell me that the cluster is out of compliance. There's compliance drift. And what it's telling us here is that the desired value of vSAN ESA is for it to be not configured. And the current state is configured. Same with the host, they have it configured. Now, there's two ways that we can resolve this. The first thing is, if we were to hit remediate on this, right, what it's going to do is it's going to remediate the cluster back to the desired state that it's currently, the current desired state of the vSphere configuration profile. And what that would do right now would be to delete the vSAN data store. So obviously we don't want to do that. The desired value being not configured, the current value being configured, we want to update the vSphere configuration profile with the new vSAN settings. Now, we can go through and manually add all these entries using the UI or using JSON. But the simplest way to do this is to go into draft and import from host. And we can choose any one of the hosts in our cluster. They're all compliant with the rest of the configuration. And there are some new options here, only existing overrides from the current configuration or only deviating settings from other hosts. These options really only apply to host overrides, and it's to prevent host overrides from getting overwritten if we're updating the cluster configuration. We're just going to leave the current option here as number one. Now, this is a live demo, not a pre-checked one. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this does go smoothly. We've imported the configuration from host 1. Now we can check. I just want to double check. We can export the configuration draft here. Let's just double check it and make sure that it has the vSAN configuration. And there's our NFS. Yes, so we have vSAN enabled, auto policy is disabled, that's fine. And under host specific settings, yes, we have our vSAN and the disk that vSAN is currently using for each of my hosts. So our draft looks good. Our draft looks like it has all our vSAN configuration. Let's run a pre-check. And this is similar to when you update settings on a host and you want to update the host profile. That's essentially what we're doing. We're updating, we're pulling a new draft from the current settings on one of the hosts, and then we're updating the cluster configuration itself. And because we're not doing any changes to the host configuration, we're actually just changing the cluster configuration spec. There should be no host going into maintenance mode, no reboots. Check the host specific level. There's no impact. Okay, so question again on ZTP, how does it pull the image from vCenter? So using that boot URL that we showed earlier, it uses HTTPS boot. You configure your ESX host or your physical hardware, the UEFI, to boot from that URL, and vCenter will do the rest. Can we recap the vCenter versions where VCP with the ZTP is available? It is available in VCF 9.1 and VVF 9.1. It's not available in 8.x. Similar technology is there in auto deploy. You can use auto deploy and vSphere configuration profiles in vSphere 8.x. you would get the pretty much the same end result. The reason that we've introduced ZTP is to update the boot protocols from PXE to HTTPS boot. And we plan on building on top of ZTP in future releases as well. Auto deploy has been around since vSphere 5, I want to say, maybe 5.1. So there's some outdated technologies there that we're improving upon and building a foundation for the future. Can you use a desired config? Oh, let me just double check this. Yes, so fingers crossed this went smoothly. We've updated our cluster config spec with our vSAN configuration to make sure now, and if we check under our settings, we can scroll down to vCenter, HCI, deployment. So ESA is enabled. There's no additional settings here to really view. It's just enabled or not. So that's just to show if you do end up enabling a vSAN after you've already enabled VCP, you should update the VCP, the vSphere configuration profile, with the new vSAN settings. And you can still manage the vSAN settings from the UI here if you wish. However, if you do make any changes here, you would then see the cluster go out of compliance with the VCP. So there is still currently work to do that when we make changes elsewhere that the VCP automatically gets updated, but we also want to make sure that we're not automatically accepting undesirable changes, right? So if a malicious actor came in here to make a change, we don't want VCP to automatically accept that either. So there's still work that we need to do there. And just before we wrap up, let me just try and clear out some of the questions. Is there a way to get desired config for vCenter? Yes, so that already exists. It's called vCenter Profiles. It is API based only. Let me check the developer center. I believe it's under vCenter profiles. I could be wrong. Okay, it might not be named, it might not be there, but there's vCenter profiles. I'm not 100% sure where exactly the API is here, but we do have vCenter profiles for exporting vCenter configuration as JSON and then using that to build multiple vCenters, and that integrates with VCF operations as well. Any HOL available? Not on the 9.1 versions currently. So once 9.1 goes GA, there will be hands-on labs available shortly afterwards. And this may be asked already, but the current server count is not quite new hosts until the host is in the cluster. Let me just. So you could configure host overrides even before the host is added to a cluster. So for example, let's pretend that I've got ESX5 that I want to add to the cluster. And if we take a look at our config spec, let's go down to host specific or host override. I could add an entry at the end here for ESX5. I could add its IP addresses for BMK012, its memory tiering devices if I knew those. I could go up to the host override section and make any overrides I want for that particular hypothetical host 5. So I could do that. I could import the JSON document into the cluster. And then when ESX5 joins the cluster, it'll automatically get that configuration spec. So you can do it before or after the host joins the cluster. It is completely up to you. Yeah, I agree, Dave, with your comment about the overrides. They are a little bit challenging to work with in the UI, and we are hoping to improve the UI workflow and the UX around this area as well in future releases. Okay, so Brian, I think that's all the questions answered.
That was a lot of questions. Appreciate you
Yeah, no,
hanging in
that
there,
was
going through them
great.
all. Yeah. No, great session. Really appreciate all that you did here. The demos were great. The presentation was great. Really appreciate it.
What was like? Oh, yes, there was one other thing I wanted to pop into the chat before I go because I have all these links here. And I think if I copy these, they will translate properly. I can send this to everybody. Oh no, it's stripping the links out. I'll send you these links so that you can share them with the audience as well when you're sending out the recording or whatever.
Yeah, that'd be great. Cool. Well, as we mentioned at the beginning, the presentation was recorded. Your TAM can make that available to you, or you can search the VMware TAM Services YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you again next month when we start covering a VCF operations or VCF 9.1 series, starting with the operations build pillar, and look for that invite to happen on June the 18th. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.